19 years old, you were married, right?
19 years old, I was married.
Work out?
Excuse me?
Did it work out for you? Getting married in 1958?
Yes, it sure did.
Good. That's what. But anyway, worked
One
out
and
for
only.
him. Worked out for him. Family just finished.
Yeah,
19 after 62 years. No more Castros in charge. So, like I said, big transitional year. It was post-war. It was going away. So we will discuss that. Do I need a mask when I talk?
no, I don't think so.
Okay.
You
All right,
know,
I just-
sometimes we don't hear what you're saying, do us?
Well, you'll hear what I say. I'll be, you'll hear it. So, Color TV, astronauts, Alaska, Hawaii,
Yeah, I've been.
Buddy Holly. I'm going to tell you a story about Buddy Holly very shortly. Frank, do I need this on?
According to my regulations, you do, yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
I do apologize.
Because
I
everybody
have
says,
to let that be, yeah.
yeah, everybody has different,
Yep.
different standards, so.
Yep. All right, I'm going to let you start, and
Okay.
it's 6:36. Ladies and gentlemen, we did this last time virtually. We did I Love Lucy. That was Evan.
Hello.
We did the I Love Lucy program. You don't remember? You sat right there and enjoyed it. Okay, you did. You did
Well,
big time.
Lucy's not.
I don't remember either. I'm all shun guys.
I don't remember.
That's okay.
Well, I want to
So-
thank Frank for inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Evan. So, yeah, he has a myriad of talks. He's a writer and a pundit, and he's been in TV a few times, and so he has a great knowledge of our culture, speaks about pop culture and sports culture. So, enjoy Evan Weiner, guys.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for being here today. And it's good to see you. It's nice to see people not on the other side of the screen. So I'm not in the screen today, but it's nice to see you on this day. 1959. Yes. Pull up.
Okay,
Okay.
because then they can see you.
Okay.
They can see your
Yeah, I
face.
got my
Okay.
2 vaccines. I got my vaccines on March
Does
3rd,
anybody, you have to tell me,
March 3rd and March
you
24th.
feel comfortable with him with his mask on?
Yes.
Are you
I
sure?
was yeah, I think.
I've been vaccinated, fully
Because I think you'll
vaccinated.
have difficulty understanding him if he
Yeah.
doesn't take his mask off.
Okay,
That's
okay.
right.
All right,
okay.
Phyllis, he's just getting started.
Just getting started. So I'm talking about 1959. I was 2 and 3 years old back in 1959. And I'm doing these early talks, for me early, because I was watching Buzzard TV. And I'm watching Bill Cullen's old Price is Right. And I'm thinking to myself, what happened to all of those companies that used to have prizes on the Price is Right? So I'm thinking, hey, that might be a good thing to talk about. What happened to all these companies? And I started looking at 1959, 1960, like, whatever happened to the DeSoto car? It just disappeared one day. Anyway, 1959 is a transitional year. Most people don't remember it as a transitional year, but it was 14 years after World War II. And this guy comes to power in Cuba, Fidel Castro. And people wanted color TVs. Color TVs are beginning to get into the home. And if you remember when you got your first color TV, mine 1968. This is New Rochelle, New York, and this is a picture I just took the other day. And they used to have a peacock up here, the NBC Peacock, but that is gone. But 62 years in business. They started in 1959. Television service, color TV. You don't see many of those banners anymore, or those neon signs anymore. They were heroes. Abel and Baker, they went up in space. And here are the 7 astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, as America now prepares to eventually go to the moon. Alaska becomes a state. That's me, and that was me 4 years ago. In Juneau, Alaska, at the Red Dog Saloon. And here I am also 4 years ago in Hawaii. I happened to be in Alaska and Hawaii 4 years ago. Major League Baseball fully integrates with Pumpsie Green playing with the Boston Red Sox, and there's Ted Williams with him. The day the music died. How many of you remember Buddy Holly?
Yeah.
You don't remember Buddy Holly. You remember Buddy Holly. The day the music died, February 1959, he goes down in a plane crash, and I have a story that I'm going to tell you that probably you haven't heard about Buddy Holly. Oh, Barbie doll. How many of you had a Barbie doll? Do you have Barbie dolls for your kids?
My kids, yes.
Your kids? You have Barbie dolls for you or your kids?
My kids.
Your kids. Well, the Barbie doll. Well, I'll talk about Barbie in a couple of minutes because she kind of has a shady past. She kind of has a shady past. And, you know, there were the shows depicting America, like Ozzie and Harriet, and Leave It to Beaver, and Father Knows Best, and, oh, him, Maynard G. Krebs. A beatnik or a member of the Beat Generation, the Dobie Gillis show. But let's talk about Cuba. Now, you could go, or you could have gone to Cuba a couple of years ago on cruise ships and things like that, and that was stopped. Cuba was apparently America's playground at one point in the 1950s. And not only that, most of Cuba was owned by American companies. And here's Fidel Castro, and he is now successful after all of these years of trying to topple the dictator Batista in Cuba. And finally, January 1959, he's victorious. He and a ragtag band, they're victorious. And this is Batista, who was the dictator. But the Americans liked Batista. Why? Because he was anti-communist. So, you know, it's like Franklin Roosevelt says, or said of, I think it was Saudi Arabia or another country in the 1930s, yeah, the guy's an SOB, but he's our SOB. Batista was our SOB, the U.S. in 1959. He leads a military coup, takes power. In 1933, he had been around since 1933, he organized a sergeant's revolt. It toppled a regime, and he became the most powerful man in Cuba. He was elected president in 1940, he left in 1944, and then he would return in the 1950s as a brutal dictator, controlling universities, the press, and Congress in Cuba. But he also embezzled huge sums of money from a soaring economy, which was helped by the American mafia, and became a playground for Americans. He used to go down to Havana. There is Castro in 1953, a young man looking to...
Doesn't look like him.
Yeah, that's Castro, 1953. He's a young man, and he's looking to topple Batista. And he leads a group that's about ready to topple him, but the attack fails. And Batista would suspend many constitutional rights in retaliation, and Castro is sentenced to 15 years in prison. He's not supposed to come out until 1968, so he's cooling his heels in prison. Except something happened along the way. Batista runs again for president in 1954, runs unopposed, because nobody wanted to run against him, or people were boycotting the election. But in 55, Castro is released. All political prisoners are released, and Fidel and Raul Castro flee to Mexico. And then they meet the revolutionary Che Guevara there. Now, I see people today walk around with Che Guevara shirts. Have you seen that? Walk around with Che Guevara's face and all, and says, Che, bet you they have no idea who he is. Probably have no idea who he is. So they meet, and he joins up with Castro, and then they set sail to Cuba from Mexico and plot to overthrow Batista. And there is Che Guevara, not on the t-shirt right now. He was supposed to be the worst of all. He'd cut out your eye just because he wanted to cut out your eye. Castro's got 81 people, 81 men. They're on this yacht. They land in eastern Cuba in December 2nd, 1956. And most of them are killed. This is a ragtag band. They don't have much weaponry or anything else. So he's down to about a dozen men, or he escapes with about a dozen men, his brother and Che Guevara. Cubans start to support Castro in 1957 and 1958 because Batista is so bad. And they liked Fidel Castro because he had charisma. And he also talked about, hey, this is a nationalistic thing in Cuba. We could do this together. We don't need Batista anymore. And Batista, well, there's corruption, there's greed, there's brutality, and inefficiency within his government. Now, there was a lot of U.S. support for him. I mean, you take a look at, all of these postcards that you could get from Havana, and it looks like you could have a really good time if you're an American in Havana. And there were a lot of Americans who entertained there. The mafia was fully entrenched there. You could go there, you could gamble. Instead of going to Las Vegas, you could go to Havana, and you could have a good time. But none of that money got down to the Cuban people. The U.S. Eisenhower says, this guy Batista may be a problem, and they're starting to pull back a little bit, but not as much as they probably should have. And they're beginning to look for, maybe if we could overthrow Batista, maybe we could have an alternative to the dictator and to Castro, but they couldn't find anybody. And this is what was going on. The ugly American. You want to have a good, take a look at this guy. He's got his sombrero on.
Who's it?
He's a tourist. He's having a good time in Cuba. Take a look at him. He's got a bottle of liquor, whatever else, rum. He's got his shorts on. He's got his cigar in his mouth, and the ugly American. Even if he was good looking, he'd probably be the ugly American. He's not really all that good looking at that point. By the late 1950s, U.S. interests, 90% of the Cuban mines. They own 80% of the public utilities, 50% of the railways, 40% of the sugar production, 25% of the bank deposits in Cuba are owned by Americans. Americans had about $1 billion worth of assets in Cuba at that point. Hey, Batista's a good partner, isn't he? The American influence extended into culture. Cubans liked American life. They drove American cars, owned TVs, watched Hollywood movies, shopped at Woolworths. How many of you shopped at Woolworths? Oh, remember they had, if you went around the luncheonette, they had that smell.
Right.
There was a distinct Woolworths smell. They listened to rock and roll, to Elvis, learned English in school, played baseball, wore American fashions. But the Cubans, they were kind of upset because the country was becoming a haven for prostitution, brothels, gambling, and that guy who you saw before in his shorts with the 2 bottles of beer or whatever. So Castro is getting his people together, and they begin a guerrilla attack against Batista. In 1958, they're successful. Ragtag army at holding back the Cuban army, even though they're outnumbered and suffering losses. And then they would capture Santa Clara, and they would have another battle where they would win. And Castro is about ready to take over the country, which he does in 1959. It's a socialist state. He and his group, small ragtag group, they beat Batista, who flees, ends up in Spain. The United States, Truman, Eisenhower, hey, you're great, you're anti-communist. But he's gone after 7 years, and Castro initially is looking to the United States for help, but he would turn to the Soviet Union. Batista would go to the Dominican Republic in 1959, and he would go elsewhere afterwards and just stay away from Cuba and just live with his money, I suppose. Meanwhile, I actually knew Dick Nixon, dealt with him. 1985, he settled the dispute between the baseball umpires and the owners, and I got to know him after that. First time I met him, I sat in his office, and his secretary said, "Oh, go and wait in his office. He'll be there in 15 minutes." And I would, I got the desk. I was like this, just like Dick Nixon, not a crook. Anyway, so here's Nixon meeting with Castro in Washington in 1959 in April. And he would place a wreath at the bottom of the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials. And, I was talking to my wife's cousin who was in 5th grade in 1959, And they were teaching kids in school in 1959 that Castro could be our friend. He could really be our friend, but the relationship would go south quickly. And there is Castro in 1959 laying a wreath, and that was probably the last time that Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers really looked at Castro as, hey, he could be an ally. He couldn't be. The new Cuban government said to people living in Cuba, we're going to give the land back to you. And we're going to defend the rights of the poor. But Castro was a Marxist, and there was a one-party system, and hundreds of people went to jail, labor camps, a lot fled into the Miami area, and thousands of middle-class Cubans fled into exile, which is why you have Little Havana in Miami. So Cuba is a United States problem. Look at that phone there. Look at that old phone. So it's a United States problem in 1959. You guys probably have never heard of Jose Valdivieso, old friend of mine. We met in the 1980s. He played baseball with the Washington Senators in the 1950s. And there's always this question about Fidel Castro. By the way, Jose hated Castro because he never went back. He never went back, never got to see his relatives or whatever, because he was doing well in the United States. He was with Channel 47, WNJU TV in New York, where he was a Spanish sports announcer. And one day, my wife and I, and we're at a function, and I introduced my wife to Jose. And I said, Jose, why don't you tell my wife what baseball player, what kind of baseball player was Castro? Because there's always this, well, what if Castro was a good baseball player? Would that have changed history? And Jose said he wasn't a good baseball player. He said every kid who had a glove and a bat in Cuba somehow got a tryout with the Washington Senators baseball team. And a couple others, but mostly Washington. And Washington would hire Cubans because they could get them on the cheap. Instead of spending $4,000 on a player, they get them for $2,000. So I said to Jose, I said, so what kind of player was he? He said he had no talent. No talent. He got a tryout because everybody else got a tryout. And he said, wouldn't have made any difference. Castro was Castro, and Jose really disliked him. Really disliked him because he said Castro robbed him of his opportunity to get back to his homeland. And Jose ended up in New Jersey. Hell of a nice guy, really nice guy, but you bring up Castro, or you brought up Castro with him, and he would get very angry, and rightfully so. He thinks Castro stole all of his land. Oh, remember I talked about the color TV? Remember I said that sign, color TV? Here's Nikita Khrushchev, and here's Richard Nixon. Looks like John Charles Daly, who was the host of What's My Line, who was a correspondent. And they're in Moscow at a trade show where American products are being shown off, and they get into a debate about communism versus capitalism versus consumerism. So Nixon and Khrushchev get into what is called the kitchen debate. The kitchen debate, well, why? Because they argued about the merits of capitalism and communism in front of a modern kitchen in Moscow at the American National Exhibition. And what are they arguing about? Color TV. Color TV, that's what they're arguing about. RCA Victor Color TV. Nixon demonstrated some of these color TVs, showing the color TV. And Khrushchev starts yelling about Captive Nations Resolution, which was in the UN that condemned the Soviet control of the captive peoples of Eastern Europe, and how it asked Americans to pray for their deliverance. And they're in front of a kitchen, and they're getting into it over a color TV. Meanwhile, Shah of Iran, the United States propped up the Shah in Iran, of Iran and the Shah for the last 5 or 6 years at that point. This would come back to bite the United States in 1979 with the Ayatollah Khomeini, but they backed the Shah. The Allies, Americans in Iran, signed cooperation agreements. Soviet Union, Iraq, they signed agreements. Israel decides to send weapons to West Germany. Weaponry to West Germany, and countries say, hey, We're not going to touch Antarctica, we'll leave it alone. Dalai Lama, who's still around. He flees Tibet in 1959. March 10th, Tibetans band together in revolt, surrounding the summer palace of the Dalai Lama because there is Chinese occupation of the area. It's a decade-long battle between Tibet and the People's Liberation Army, China. And by March 17th, the Chinese artillery was aimed at the palace. The Dalai Lama was evacuated. He went to India. 62 years later, the Dalai Lama remains in exile. Laos fell, Pathet Lao. You know, Dwight Eisenhower told John Kennedy in 1961, as he was leaving the presidency and Kennedy was coming in, Laos is your big problem. Not South Vietnam. Laos is your big problem. That's what you got to take care of. There was a civil war in Laos. And it was waged between the communists and the Royal Lao government in 1975. 16 years later, Eisenhower was right. Laos was a problem, but the Americans never did anything really with it. Space, 1959, the space race accelerates. The Soviets send Lunar 2 to see the moon, and it hits the moon. And another Soviet spacecraft, the Lunik 3, took pictures of the far side or the dark side of the moon. Do you remember the monkey Miss Baker? She went up in space. She was a hero for 4 days. Unfortunately, well, let's get to Abel and Baker, 2 monkeys, and they're shot into space, 360 miles up. And they experienced about 9 minutes of weightlessness. And when they came back, they're huge celebrities. They're on the cover of Life magazine. There's a press conference for them, even though they can't really say what they felt. And news correspondents, according to the New York Times, pushed each other and climbed over chairs. Just to see these 2 monkeys. But the monkeys, they just wanted peanuts and crackers. Unfortunately, Miss Abel died 4 days after the flight because she had an operation to remove electrodes. Didn't go well, and she died. But here's the Mercury 7 astronauts. America decides, hey, we got to send people in space. And here they are, Wally Schirra, Scott Carpenter, Gus Grissom, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, and Gordon Cooper, and Scott Carpenter. Here they are. The NASA 7. And they would eventually, 6 of them would go on Mercury crafts. Slayton did not go because he had some sort of ailment and he would not go into space until 1975. They were stars. They were on the cover of Life magazine. Absolute stars, superstars. Their wives were on the cover of Life magazine. 1 of 7, first Americans in space. But they weren't, the monkeys were. The American monkeys. How do you pick an astronaut? How do you pick an astronaut? Ever figure out how you pick an astronaut? I mean, what do? You go to the want ads in the papers in those days and say, we want a daredevil who's ready to risk his life? They had no idea. They had no idea how to pick an astronaut. And they're trying to figure out, well, who's crazy enough to be an astronaut? They couldn't find any. So they said, you know what? We got a whole military here. Let's just get 7 test pilots and let's see what we can do. And that's what they did. 7 test pilots. Because how do you go pick an astronaut? I mean, you know, look at the New York Times Help Wanted section. Astronaut wanted. Must be willing to risk their lives. Salary with experience. The beginning of the end of American prosperity after World War II starts here. The 116-day steelworkers strike in 1959. About 500,000 steelworkers walked out in July and they threatened to send the nation back into a recession. The strike caused shortages in the auto industry, prompting automakers to threaten to lay off tens of thousands of workers. In October, Eisenhower invokes the Taft-Hartley Act, which forces the workers back to their jobs. Eisenhower says if permitted to continue, this strike would imperil the national health and safety. January 1960, the strike was finally settled, but the damage was done. Major damage that would impact all of us in here our lifetimes, because the big steel companies found out that the United States wasn't the only one producing steel. Between the end of World War II and 1958, Americans controlled the steel market. And the American economy was hot. And the American car dealers, it was U.S. Steel, it was Ford, it was General Motors, it was what's the Ford, General, and Chrysler. Those were the three big companies. But people say, hey, listen, we don't have to buy American. We could buy, we'd go somewhere else and buy steel, and they did. Oh yeah, the workers got some increased wages, cost of living provisions, some benefits, but the strike would end the American dominance of the steel industry and began the erosion of the upper Midwest, which created the Rust Belt and created all sorts of problems by the late 1970s. This is Wheeling, West Virginia, and I was there in 2018. I'm just going to give you an example of a city that was ruined. Wheeling, West Virginia. That building back there is empty. There are holes in the street where buildings used to be. Wheeling has fallen apart. It's one of the worst cities in the United States. In 1960, it had 53,000 people. Today, it has half the population. 1968, Wheeling Steel, big company, merged with Pittsburgh Steel to become the 9th largest steelmaker in the United States. But 1985 comes along, that company goes bankrupt. 2009, Servostel, which is its successor, ends manufacturing operations in Wheeling. The move lays off 3,100 workers in Western Virginia and Ohio, and this is repeated in Buffalo, in Pittsburgh, in Cleveland, in Detroit. And if you wonder why people talk about go to the Midwest and they're upset about what's going on in the Midwest, steel is gone, coal is gone, and they used to run things. Also, the other thing in 1959, which put New York City, or New York State rather, into a major recession that it hasn't recovered, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which will take you from Nova Scotia all the way to Milwaukee. Where is Milwaukee on here? Well, I guess here, Milwaukee's right there. Right there, rather, Milwaukee. So, anyway, that destroys upstate New York. Absolutely destroys upstate New York. 1959 opening, destroys the Erie Canal. But it does open up the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to the Great Lakes. And at first it's great. Milwaukee was supposed to benefit. It was supposed to become this huge city because it was going to be this port. Dwight Eisenhower wasn't too sure he wanted to invest into the St. Lawrence Seaway, but he would. It cost $470 million Canadian. $336 million of that was the Canadian government, and the rest came from the United States. When it opened, Queen Elizabeth was there along with Dwight Eisenhower, and the 2,300-mile superhighway for the ocean freighters. It was great in 1959, but 62 years later, maybe not. Maybe not. And Milwaukee, with my son there, never became the city it was supposed to be. The Port of Milwaukee director, a guy by the name of Henry Broekel, said, the St. Lawrence Seaway will be the greatest single development of the century in its efforts on Milwaukee's future growth and prosperity. And then Lester Olson, who is the president of the Milwaukee Association of Commerce, said the magnitude of the potential of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the power of projects stir the imagination of the world. Milwaukee is still a beer town. That's what it is. Oh, that's Cortland, New York. Earlier this decade, or last decade, I used to speak at SUNY Cortland annually, and one day I decided to see what happened to Cortland. Well, what happened to Cortland was Smith Corona typewriters. Remember the Smith Corona typewriters? That's where they came from. Out of business. Moved to Mexico. Goods into New York that flowed up the Hudson and west on the Erie Canal. The cities that suffered: Gloversville, Binghamton, Endicott, Portland, Syracuse, Rochester. Although Rochester, the companies there that shot themselves in the foot. Kodak was stupid and so was Xerox. Both of them, this digital thing, man, don't worry. And Buffalo declined after 1960. Half of the world's typewriters were made in Syracuse in 1920. Half of them. But trains came along and the Erie Canal was kind of decommissioned. And today the St. Lawrence Seaway is the main route for Ontario grain exports to overseas markets. Buffalo was once one of the richest cities, or the richest city in the United States. More millionaires per capita than anywhere else because of the Erie Canal and everything else that went along with it. Buffalo was great in the 19th century. It's not today. When the canal traffic collapsed, factories in the region, mainly steel and grain operations, went out of business. But that is the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is now the home of cruise ships. That's basically what you see on the St. Lawrence Seaway, cruise ships. From Nova Scotia to the Great Lakes, forms part of the U.S.-Canadian border, and Europe is no longer a major grain importer. The shipments now go to South America, Asia, and Africa. The Seaway does not do much business. Martin Luther King went to India in 1959 to salute and honor Gandhi. The Civil Rights Movement, 1959, the federal judge throws out segregation on Atlanta, Georgia buses, while another orders Montgomery bus registers to comply. Federal Appeals Court overturns Virginia's closure of schools in Norfolk with black students. Martin Luther King speaks in Washington, a rally of about 26,000. And November 20th, Alabama passes laws to limit black voter registration. Supreme Court yesterday basically did the same thing to the Navajo Indians. Malcolm X makes his debut on the world stage in 1959. That's Mike Wallace. Remember Mike Wallace?
Yeah.
Myron Wyszynski. Anyway, the hate that produced hate. And that was done on the New York City television station, July 23rd, by Mike Wallace. And Wallace said the show was a study of the rise of black racism, or of a call for black supremacy among a small but growing segment of the American Negro population. Elijah Muhammad from the Nation of Islam was on. Malcolm X talked him into it. And there was a lot of negativity around this show, except Malcolm said, it seems everywhere I went, telephones were ringing afterwards, asking him about the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam's profile grows, and the white community and the civil rights movement become very wary. The show was panned as being rather sensationalized. How many of you know Miles Davis? Miles Davis, the jazz man. He's beaten up outside of Roseland in Manhattan. The great jazz trumpeter Miles Davis is at the height of his fame and artistic powers. He's profiled, harassed, and assaulted by a police officer in Manhattan. Alaska and Hawaii become states. That's the Mendenhall Glacier outside of Juneau, Alaska. And that's Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii. On January 7th, 1948, Harry Truman encouraged Hawaii to become a state. On November 7th, 1950, Hawaiian voters said, hey, yeah, let's become a state, 82,778 to 27,109. The road to statehood, combined Alaska-Hawaii statehood, goes to the Senate floor in 1952 and goes nowhere. 1953, the House of Representatives approves Hawaii statehood. Senate, we're not going to do it. But 1954, the Senate says, yeah, let's do it. 57-28, yeah, let's do it, but nothing happens. In 57 and 58, the Hawaiian delegate, John A. Burns, decided the strategy of giving Alaska statehood and then delaying statehood for Hawaii was okay. Eisenhower wanted to give Hawaii statehood, but was uncertain about Alaska. Why? Because they thought Alaska would be all Democrats, Hawaii would be all Republicans. Actually, it turned out it flipped. It was a political calculus. Eventually, the Senate would pass the Alaska statehood bill, and that's Anchorage. If you're in that corner of Anchorage, that's how far it is to other cities. It was time to get rid of Alaska, according to Russia back in the 1860s. They thought the U.S. would just overrun Alaska and just take Alaska one day. They also thought that they'd lose it to Great Britain. They weren't taking care of it, and they lost to Great Britain in the Crimean War, and they had debt, so why don't we sell it? And we'll sell it because this guy, William H. Seward, guy who has the high school named after him, Lower East Side of Manhattan, where Bernie Schwartz went to school, Tony Curtis, decides he's going to buy it. And he does. $7 million. Ridiculed. Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. And that's Sitka. That was the last Russian capital. That's 4th of July, 2017. That's where I spent the 4th of July that year. The territory of Alaska, or the Alaska Territory, was organized, became a territory that existed from 1912 to 59 when it became a state. The territory was created as the District of Alaska on May 17, 1884. That is the wettest spot in the on the continent, Ketchikan. And it becomes extremely important during World War II because they thought the Japanese, the Americans, would attack somewhere on the West Coast. And well, hey, they can't attack if you have a base there, and they put a base there in Whittier. And it was successful. And 1946, Alaskans said, let's become a state. That is Whittier. And I don't know if any of you were in combat or anything, that cloud is always there. And it was before radar, and this is where Americans had a lot of military. And you couldn't find them because of that glob of clouds. And they constructed the base in Whittier, which is now a cruise port. Things were hard to detect there. There are the Eagles, and Alaska's statehood begins in 1959. And that was the short-lived 49 star flag. That was very short-lived, 1 year. And there is Oahu. That's where Mark Twain actually stood, allegedly, and talked about how Oahu was great. Hawaii, one of 4 independent republics, now part of the United States. The Vermont Republic, Texas Republic, California Republic. All were independent nations. California for only about 28 days. Hawaii had formal and international diplomatic recognition. But there was a coup. The Queen is knocked off in 1893 because there were a bunch of business guys that, hey, we want to just take over this country, this country, and they did. They absolutely did. There's the palace, which was the capital, which became the capital of the Republic of Hawaii. There was a guy by the name of Sanford B. Dole who decided business would be a lot better if we controlled it and it wasn't Hawaii who controlled it. So they overthrew the monarchy. And he was the president of Hawaii until it became annexed by the United States. And there is Dole. He was a lawyer and he wanted to run the country. And he did. He did. Grover Cleveland's the president of the United States, and he knows that Hawaii's government is illegally overthrown by a bunch of business guys. He doesn't do anything. He wants to do something. He says that they did it illegally, but doesn't have any teeth in what he's saying. He says, bring back the Queen. Provisional government says, no, it's ours now. Queen, she's gone. The Hawaiian Republic there. There was a president of the Republic, Lauren A. Thurston, and he says, no, Dole should be the guy. He was the only president of the territory, 1894 to 1898. And they told William McKinley, hey, why don't you take this? Take it from us, annex us. You know, we're giving it to you. And McKinley would take it. And there's McKinley's statue in Buffalo where he was killed in 1901. So he says, yeah, you know, that's a good thing, you know, yeah, you know what, let's take it. And the Americans do. They annexed the Republic of Hawaii under the pretext that there was a Spanish-American War. And remember the Maine, New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst, remember the Maine. So, you know, as part of the 1898 Spanish-American War, McKinley says, yeah, let's take it because this is important to our economy and we could put a military base in there. And that would make sense because we have some interest in Asia and we got to make sure nobody else overtakes that island. And there's Hawaii's new government. 1598, Hawaii becomes part of America. The sugar lobby, which didn't want tariffs on their exports, got what they wanted. And, well, the royal family is remembered. 1900, Hawaii becomes a self-governing territory of the United States. And the guys who ran the sugar and other industries say it's great because we bring in cheap foreign labor because in the United States on the mainland you couldn't do that and we could get away with literally murder. And they did. And then there was colonialism. The president, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Interior, Minister of Finance, Minister of Public Instruction, Auditor General, Deputy Auditor General, Surveyor General, Marshal and Deputy Marshal of the Republic of Hawaii, out of jobs. Washington runs the show, and the people in Hawaii could not vote for president. They couldn't vote for Congress, but they had all the benefits provided by the Constitution, which would have included Social Security. But it was the naval base to be that would become really important. In 1908, Congress spent $3 million to straighten the channel and establish the naval station at Pearl Harbor because the U.S. said Pearl Harbor is important strategically as a military outpost. And you know the rest of the story. That's the USS Arizona Memorial, which I was on in 2005. December 7th, 1941, 7:48 Hawaiian time. The base was attacked. The Arizona was sunk among others. 8 battleships damaged. 6 were returned and fought the war. And it was Franklin Roosevelt's war after that. There was martial law in Hawaii. Civil courts closed. Martial law was suspended in 1944. There was curfews and regulation of night driving, and censorship of newspapers and radio broadcasts, and there was price control on everything. December 7th, 1941, date lived in infamy because of Pearl Harbor. By 1954, there was a revolution in Hawaii saying, general strikes, protests, and civil disobedience make us a state. And they would make them a state by 1960. The vote, yes, you want or don't you want? June 27, 1959, and Hawaii would become a state and joined the United States in 1960, but for all intents and purposes, it was done in 1959. You probably don't know who this guy is. Diamond Dave Somerville. Remember the Diamonds? The group, doo-wop group, the Diamonds? That's Diamond Dave. And anyway, so he told me, he said, don't I look like Bob Barker? Do you look like Bob Barker a little bit? Anyway, he was on that tour that Buddy Holly was killed on. And he was telling me the story. February 3rd, 1959, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, JP, the Big Bopper Richardson, joined their pilot, Roger Peterson, to fly to the next stop. The passengers and the pilot never made it. Crashed in Iowa. Now, what Dave told me was pretty simple. Buddy Holly was tired of being on the bus tour, and he had some money. So he was able to charter a plane. All he wanted to do was get to a hotel to take a hot bath. And he figured the best way of doing that is taking a plane. The day the music died. February 3rd, 1959. And Dave said that Buddy was a hell of a nice guy. Really, really nice guy. All he wanted was a warm bath. Dave traveled with Buddy on that tour. The plane crashed. They were in shock. Dave had a book that came out called The Boys on the Bus, all about rock and roll in the 1950s. Civil rights movement in sports, the Elgin Baylor protest, which you probably didn't ever hear of. Major League Baseball, all 16 teams finally integrate. There's Elgin Baylor with the Minneapolis Lakers, January 15th, 1959, 16th. There's a game in Charleston, West Virginia, segregated town. Baylor and his black teammates could not stay at the hotel, whites only, so he staged a strike. He refused to play. I love basketball. I like playing in the league very much, but not at the expense of my dignity. There's Baylor and the owner, Bob Short. Elgin Baylor just passed away recently. Short and the NBA president, Maurice Puloff, were irate. They were really upset that they were going to lose a gate. But they publicly sided with Baylor, and ultimately there was a rule that if players, NBA was going to play in segregated states, they wouldn't do it unless all the players could stay at the same hotels and eat at the same restaurants. That didn't happen either. Something happened in 1961. Pumpsie Green, who played with the New York Mets, became the first African-American player with the Boston Red Sox. 16 teams, last one to go was Boston, Tom Yawkey's team. Makes his debut July 21st against the Chicago White Sox. Raisin in the Sun. Raisin in the Sun, play written by Lorraine Hansby, opens on Broadway, the first Broadway show to be produced by a black woman. A black man directs it. Odds Against Tomorrow, Harry Belafonte, first African American to produce a film through his own company. And Berry Gordy Jr., the guy who invented Motown, actually invented another record label the year before. On January 12, 1959, Tamla Records, which was supposed to be called Tammy Records, but after the Debbie Reynolds character, couldn't get that name. But Tamla Records started, and it was all black music. Joyous, sad, romantic, groovin', moving music. Tamla Records was incorporated by Motown in 1960. How many of you had that? Barbie doll. Barbie. She has a sinister past, you know. Ruth Handler was the president of the toy manufacturer Mattel. She invented the Barbie doll, but really she didn't invent the Barbie doll. She walks into this Swiss shop and she sees this doll, which is actually an adult toy. She gives it virtue. She redesigns it and she names it Barbie after her daughter Barbie. It sold a lot of dolls. Mickey Mouse Club was instrumental in helping the Barbie doll. They put all their money in advertising into the Mickey Mouse Club, and it worked. It worked. The ad campaign worked, and Barbie became a smash hit because of the Mickey Mouse Club. The golden age of TV is over in 1950, quiz show scandals. Washington politicians get involved, and they would change the rules of quiz shows. Violence on TV, The Untouchables, Robert Stack and the machine guns and all that other stuff. Well, educators and parents groups and others say, hey, it's not Ozzie and Harriet, it's not Leave It to Beaver, it's not Father's Knows Best, it's going to ruin children. Bonanza. Bonanza is actually a show that changed things. September 12th it starts. It almost got canceled, had a large budget, but it was shot in color, and RCA decided, hey, you know what, we're trying to sell color TVs, and NBC, you put it on, and they moved it from Saturday to Sunday, and bum 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 Bonanza. There were actually words to that song, and it was all about this, color TV. That's all it was, sell it. The show would take on two topics eventually that was never addressed in primetime: anti-Semitism and racism. That would come a couple of years later. Remember this guy? Maynard G. Krebs on the Dobie Gillis Show, good buddy Dobe. Maynard became the quintessential beatnik. But who were the beatniks? It was a term. Maynard and Horde worked. He was unwashed, had a goatee, went to school wearing a sweatshirt with holes, carried bongo drums, spouted bad poetry, spoke in a language his parents couldn't understand. So what was a beatnik? Well, was it Jack Kerouac rather? Here's a beat. He's beat. On the road. He supposedly termed the term beat generation because he and his friends were beaten down at the frustration of individual expression after World War II when artists wanted to say something. Beat was derived from beatific, suggesting that the beats earned intellectual grace through the purity of their lives. But this guy, Herb Caen, who was a columnist in San Francisco, coined the phrase beatnik after Sputnik. Nobody really knows what a beatnik is, just Herb Caen. He said 250 bearded cats and kids slopping up free booze at a party sponsored by Look magazine. Those are beatniks. Look magazine was supportive of beatniks. But beatniks really probably didn't exist. The beat movement started in the 1940s, lasted into the early 1960s, and it was a distaste for American culture and society as it was after World War II. A lot of poetry, Allen Ginsberg with Howl and all that other stuff, talking about Eastern religions and Buddhism. And there's Ginsberg, but it eventually would fade. Beats were not beatniks. The Beats rejected the term beatnik. In a letter to the New York Times, Ginsberg shared his thoughts. The foul word beatnik. If beatniks and not illuminated beat poets overrun this country, they would have been created not by Kerouac, by industries of mass communications, which continue to brainwash men. Ban Lady Chatterley's Lover. U.S. Post Office. Can't send it through the mail. They ban it because it's smut. Federal District Court said, no, it's not obscene. You can mail it. Switzerland, women voters. No women voters. We don't want women to vote. 1959. The American Football League is formed. That's Tom Flores, who played in the American Football League back in 1960. By 1958, the economics of football began to stabilize, and two Texans, Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams, tried to get NFL teams in Dallas and Houston. The owner said no. They tried to buy the Chicago Cardinals, moving to Texas. The owner said no. So on August 14th, the American Football League was formed with Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Denver, New York getting teams, and eventually Buffalo and Boston would join. That's an image from Earth, from a satellite. Boeing 707 jet airliner comes into play, cuts 8 hours from transatlantic flights. First pictures of the Earth, which you just saw, taken by Explorer 6, Microchip USA, Jack Gilby. Oh, remember Milwaukee? We're going to become real big because of the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is my garage, by the way. I got all these old things. Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, Pabst and Blatz. There was a merger between Pabst and Blatz in Milwaukee. And the Justice Department said, no, can't have the merger. Remember, Milwaukee was going to become great. The merger happened in February. The Justice Department said no. Blatz said, good, we'll go out of business. And Pabst bought out whatever the assets were. And this guy is the father of pantyhose. How many of you worn pantyhose? Gant is the father of pantyhose. Alan Gant, panty legs. So he's going from North Carolina to see the Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1958 with his wife, who's pregnant, Ethel Boone Gant. And she said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore because I can't put on thigh-high stockings and a girdle and a garter belt. I can't do this. I don't want to do all this stuff, which is now, of course, a part and parcel to adult films. I wouldn't know about that, by the way, but that's what I've heard. Anyway, so he creates pantyhose, makes life a lot easier for women. Oh, the Bic pen. How many of you have Bic pens? Comes into the United States in 1959. Francis Marcel Pic introduces a pen, 29 cents. If you want to buy it today, it's $2.57 with the slogan, "Right's first time, every time." The 1959 legacy. Well, there's Castro. Castro's lasted 62 years. They ran Cuba until 2021. The Rust Belt. Well, its economic downturn starts in 1959 and continues in many areas, not only the Rust Belt, but the Northeast. The Barbie doll sold more than 1 billion. Pretty good for an adult toy, right? Buddy Holly influenced many musicians, including the Beatles. Paul McCartney owns the rights to all of Buddy Holly's songs. The Beats and the Beatniks would fade within a few years. Oh, that thing called color TV, even though this is in black and white, I caught on. Alan Shepard would be the only Mercury astronaut to walk on the moon. That's the last year of colonialism in Africa and Asia. That would change. Motown in 1960 would be paired with Tamla Records. The civil rights movement stalled in 1959, but it would pick up a lot of steam starting in February 1960. Laos would eventually fall to the communists. And how many of you remember the song American Pie by Don McLean? The day the music died. Don McLean had a monster record in 1971 called American Pie, which basically sort of tells the story about what happened to America and music after Buddy Holly's crash. Well, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments about 1959? Any remembrances of Barbie dolls and records and all that stuff? Where were you in 1959? You were just married.
Oh, yes,
Have any?
just married.
Just married. No kids on the way yet, huh?
1960.
Oh, a kid was on the way.
Yeah,
Kid was on the way.
that's right. And I had 4 after that.
4. 1959, transitional year. A year of transition, and it sets up the swinging 60s. And a lot of stuff happened in 1960. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Hope you
A lot of
enjoyed it.
stuff. You remind us a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So anyway, so we'll, anyway, we'll talk to you later then.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.